So, welcome on in everyone to our 2025 Junior Summit. We're going to be talking today about the most important things for juniors to be considering between now and college deadlines. So, I'm Jim Wismer. I'm the director here at Ivy Experience. I oversee all of our standardized test prep and academic tutoring, and I also speak with a lot of our new families about their plans and kind of point them where to go within our Ivy Experience ecosystem. I'll let Alyssa introduce herself.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for making the time to be with us tonight. My name is Alyssa Coltrane. I am the Director of College Admissions for Ivy Experience, which means I work with many of our junior students on every aspect of the college application process, starting with brainstorming all the way through nagging them to make sure they've submitted their housing deposit. All right. And Jordan, I'll let you introduce yourself as well.
Hi everyone, my name is Jordan Holmes. I am the Assistant Director of College Admissions at Ivy Experience. Similar to Alyssa, working with students from beginning to end of this wild and crazy college admission process, and helping them make sure that they also submit their housing deposits and also email me back. So,
Excellent. So, a couple housekeeping items before we get started today. One is that for everyone who's registered for this webinar, you will receive a follow-up email that has a link to a YouTube recording. We really appreciate it if you can share that with other families who might be interested in it. We do these webinars to educate the community because this is kind of a complicated process and we want to make sure we can spread the word as well as we can. It's also a great way for people to kind of get to know us and our way of viewing this process and our philosophy on working with students in case they may be interested in working with us. Second point, please drop any questions you have into the Q&A feature of Zoom. We're going to handle them all at the end of the presentation, and so definitely stick around for that Q&A. All right, so with that said, we're going to jump into what is the first slide of most of our presentations here, which I know some of our veteran webinar attendees in the chat know, which are what we call the 5 factors that are actually in a student's control in college admissions. So there are all kinds of things in college admissions that are outside of a student's control. Things like your demographic information, what other students at your high school are doing and where they're applying to college, your parents' education level. All these things could affect a student, being accepted to a college or not. However, students have no control over that other stuff, right? So we like to focus all of our advice for families and all of our services on the areas where students can really put their time and money to essentially help themselves. So the idea here is that your grades and academic rigor, standardized test scores, letters of recommendation, extracurricular activities, and your actual applications, and especially the written components of those applications, are the places where students can have the biggest impact on this process when they decide to invest their time and energy into it. And so that's going to be kind of our organizing principle for the presentation as well. With that said, let's talk about factor number 1, grades and academic rigor. So typically grades and academic rigor are the most important factor in college admissions, and that's true at the vast majority of schools in the vast majority of cases. Of course, your mileage may vary on the edges. We'll talk a little bit about that, I'm sure, in time. But generally speaking, having excellent grades and a high level of rigor is really going to help you in this process. So one important thing about grades, we know that, everyone says junior year is the most important year of grades for college admissions. And that is largely true, mainly because junior year is the last full year of academic performance that a college is going to see before you get to campus. So your college freshman self is going to be a lot more similar to your junior year self than it was to your freshman year self, right? That makes sense. However, one thing I definitely want to hit on here is that senior year grades still really matter. And that's especially true for the beginning of senior year because your grades in whatever shape they're in as of when you submit your application will be sent to a college. And often colleges are going to be, for their regular decision deadlines, especially, receiving an update on your grades later on in the process. So just remember that your senior year grades do matter. Obviously, priority number one right now is get through junior year alive and doing as well as you possibly can. But don't let that kind of senioritis kick in until you have put down a deposit at school. And ideally, not at all, by the way, especially if you're taking APs and can possibly get college credit for those in the sprint. That would be a huge wasted opportunity. But the point here is that you don't want to let your foot up on the gas from a grades and rigor standpoint at any point, because I like to use a metaphor that your grades and performance in the classroom, your high school transcript essentially, you can think of that in NFL draft terms as like your college game film. It's the whole body of work that you put together over 4 years or 3 years or three and a quarter when you apply to college. Um, and then your standardized test scores are sort of like your NFL combine results. How fast did you run the 40-yard dash? How far can you jump? How much weight can you lift? Right. And those measures are really important to add context and important information. And we'll talk about that in a second. But that large sample size of how you performed in the long run is super, super important. And it's going to be what people look at first in this process. That said, one of the things that parents are typically most surprised by is just how rampant grade inflation has gotten in high schools in America. So what I'm showing here, I'm going to have a few graphs. Sorry, I'm a testing and grades nerd and college data nerd in general. This is the percentage of freshmen at four-year colleges and universities that had at least an A minus average in high school. And we can see in the mid 60s, that percentage was 21.8%. And we can see in 2023, the last year for which we have complete data, that was 85.8%. So essentially, most students, really 86-ish% of students, have at least an A minus average when they're applying to college. And that's just important to note because I hear from a lot of parents who will call in and say, my student's a really great student. They have mostly A's and a couple B's, but they're not a good test taker. And I just point this out because having mostly A's and a couple B's doesn't make a student a really great student. Now, I'm not trying to make anyone feel bad if those are their grades. It's just that grades themselves do not tell the full story of a student anymore. So while it's important to have excellent grades on their own aren't necessarily going to tell the whole story. And just to reemphasize this, I have data from the University of Pittsburgh. This is a super popular school with our Pennsylvania students and even students applying out of state from outside of Pennsylvania. And this shows that 67% of the University of Pittsburgh's freshman class at their main Pittsburgh campus had over a 4.0 weighted GPA in high school, with their average GPA being 4.13. So I point this out just so that people understand kind of the situation with grades right now, because parents, these are not the same types of grades that were given out when you were in school. I like to say grading is a cultural practice, and cultural practices change over time. So what used to be considered A-level work, that definition has changed. And now the definition of A-level work has broadened. And that's just a reality that we have to come to terms with when we're advising students on this process. So one of the things that can help you stand apart in a world where many students have very strong grades is academic rigor. And so with academic rigor, I know course selection decisions have really already been made for most of you, but of course, edits can always be made to those. We always get the question, is it better to get an A in the advanced level class or a B in the honors or AP level class, right? Like, when is it worth it to bump up to that next level of rigor? And if we had a one size fits all answer to that, we would give it to you. The closest we can come up with is you need to challenge yourself and you need to put yourself in a position to be successful. So if you are, only taking, kind of standard level classes and you're easily getting A's in all of them, that's probably a signal that you should step up your rigor for the next year. Try to challenge yourself with more courses. If you're taking all APs and losing sleep and barely keeping up or not keeping up in those classes, that's a signal to, turn it down a notch. One thing I would say that's especially important is to be honest next year if it is time to drop a class. Often there's a period at the beginning of the semester. Some schools call it an add drop period. where you can drop down a level and that original course won't show up on your transcript as something you drop down from. If that's the case, then you can essentially appear to a college that you were in the right level course the whole way. The last thing I'll say about course selection is that if your number one and only goal in the college admissions process is to be admitted to the most selective possible school, which all three of us would tell you is kind of a silly goal. Don't do it that way. But if that was your only goal, then taking the very most challenging courses available at your school and getting straight A's in them is what you have to do. And that's because admission to those universities is so competitive. And I don't mean to say you're disqualified if you don't do that, but it is important to know that those schools, and many of them even say it on their websites, we expect students to take the most challenging curriculum available. That's a phrasing you'll often see. So if that, admission to those highly selective schools is super important to you, then that's something you really need to keep in mind. Each time you go down a rigor level, you're adding an extra obstacle for yourself to that specific goal. With that, I'll turn it over to one of the ways we add context to grades, which is letters of recommendations with teachers.
So, in addition to the courses that you'll be taking and selecting, letters of recommendation is another thing that is in your control. Asking why they're important is important as well. It's a way to, again, as Jim said, add context to your application and to those grades specifically. The grades just talk about your academic performance. However, the letters of recommendation can tell what happened between the first and the last day of that class that you're getting the recommendation from. It can talk about some of the soft skills. It can talk about some of the things that you are doing in the class and what's important to you and what you're excited about as well. Now, who you ask is just as important as when you ask as well, which we'll talk about both of those things. But typically, you should ask at least 1 to 2 teachers and your college counselor for a letter of recommendation. We recommend asking the junior core subject teacher just because some schools will have requirements for the courses that you have to ask from. Some will ask for one STEM teacher, a math or science teacher. Some will ask for a humanities teacher as well. Some don't care, but it's important for you to do a little bit of research to find out what schools are asking for from you. When you are asking for a recommendation letter, go to the people who love you and know you the most. Just because you got an A in the course does not mean that you should ask that teacher or that professor, that instructor, because you might just sit there, you raise your hand every once in a while, you get an A, you move on. But that recommendation may not be as strong as one of a teacher that maybe you got a B in, but you worked really hard. You went after school, you asked them questions, you asked for extra help. They're also then your club advisor, and they know you're in a different form as well. So again, look for the good relationships from the people that you ask as well. You can ask for optional recommendations or optional recommenders as well. Use that with a grain of salt, though, and really think about what that other recommender is asking for, or rather adding to your situation. Because again, if it's just going to be another teacher that says they're great in the classroom, they're great in the classroom, they're not adding another dimension. Whereas maybe a coach or a club advisor or someone from your community, maybe a religious leader or something like that, they can add a lot more context to your application and make sure that you're getting a different dimension that's already mentioned previously. As far as when we are asking students, or rather asking teachers, it should be before you leave school this year. Please make sure that you're asking now-ish. Teachers get swamped with these requests, especially beginning of your senior year. So we really want to make sure that you're reaching out to the students, or rather to the teachers, who are probably going to be a little bit more popular, or at least anybody who you want to ask to write a recommendation letter. Asking them now gives them the time to think about what they can write about you, gives them the time to consider this as well. You should also ask in person and also virtually follow up as well, just to make sure you're covering both ends and give some information as you reach out to them too. Say, I would love for you to write a recommendation letter for me. Do you still have capacity? If so, great. I'm thinking about applying to these kinds of schools. I'm thinking about majoring in these kinds of majors. They may also ask you for a brag sheet, and even not, that might be a good idea for you to send them as well. we really want to make sure that you're putting your best foot forward and not necessarily that you're leading the witness by any means, but that you are highlighting the things that you would like to be highlighted in your recommendation letter. If they're your math teacher and you really enjoyed the lesson on integrals and you did really, really well on that test, putting on that brag sheet saying, I really enjoyed this lesson and I understood this concept really well and I feel like I did really well on this test. Information like that and anecdotes like that can help showcase and jog their memory also of the things that were so special or stand out for you in that class and the relationship with them. So make sure you're following up with them via email, send them some information that can be helpful for them in writing the recommendation letter as well.
In my short stint as a college professor, or at least an instructor at a college, I was asked to write two letters of recommendation. One, a student just asked me. The second one, the student asked me and gave me a bunch of suggestions for what to include in that letter. Guess which one I preferred writing? The one where I had a lot of help and a starting point, right? So just remember, it's a favor to teachers when you give them this information. Don't feel like you're putting words in their mouth. They can still choose what they include or not. With all of that said, we're going to hop back to the more nerdy end of the spectrum with standardized testing. And so I'm going to talk about my favorite topic, everyone else's least favorite topic, usually. But I'll try to at least keep it as brief as I can. I know many juniors in here. I see some names of families who've worked with us on standardized testing are already done with standardized testing. So I realize this doesn't apply to everyone, but we're finalizing standardized testing plans here. So let's talk about it. The reason standardized testing is important is to predict a student's success at college, compare them with other students from their high school, and because it's part of a holistic review process. So I mentioned grade inflation earlier. I showed you this data. I won't harp on it. What I will do is show you what ACT scores look like over that same time period. Not exactly the same time period. We don't have ACT data that goes all the way back to 1966. This is from 1990, and you can see that scores have pretty much held the same and actually started to dip a little bit after the COVID pandemic. The reason I include this is just to show that colleges understand that standardized testing does tell them the same year or same thing year in and year out, whereas grades are not necessarily going to tell you the same thing year in and year out because there are more A's every year and from one high school to another. So the idea is that standardized testing helps them to understand things independent of context, or at least a different type of context. The other thing that's important to point out here, I have data here from the Opportunity Insights study done by a few Ivy League professors. This study specifically targeted students at what we call Ivy Plus universities, which is to say the Ivy League. And in this case, Ivy Plus always means something different when you ask people, but in this case, it was Stanford, Duke, Chicago, and MIT, in addition to the 8 Ivy League schools. And what it shows is that the graph on the right here, our orange line, is the correlation between high school GPA and college GPA. And you can see right here that, you know, a high school GPA of 3.1 predicted a college GPA between 3.4 and 3.5. And then a perfect high school GPA predicted a college GPA just over 3.5. When you contrast that with the stratification in test scores and the predicted GPA, you can get all the way from a 1200 just over 3.2 and a perfect 1600 over 3.6. You can see that the test scores are actually telling college a lot more about what to expect from a student's freshman year GPA in college than a GPA can. A big part of that is grade compression. And this is something that it comes with grade inflation. As grades go up, that means that the range of grades shrinks. So you can even see on this graph, there are a whole lot more dots towards the right? Most of the data is clustered at the top. Now that's true for test scores as well, but that's more about who gets in and out. Whereas this is going to be somewhat representative of GPAs at large. Where you're going to see more clustered at the top, and therefore they have less explanatory power in predicting college performance. So without getting too bogged down in the weeds, standardized testing essentially is a better predictor, especially at more selective colleges, of how students tend to do when they show up on campus. The other important thing to know about standardized testing as we come into this end of junior year, planning for potential fall of senior year testing, Test optional is, of course, a very valid option at some schools. But you probably see on this slide many testing policies you've never heard of before, at least two: test required with rare exception and test preferred. And these are terms that we have made up to explain what's actually going on, because any of these three middle policies is just going to be labeled as test optional. Because all test optional means is that you can apply with or without a test score. And whether you apply with or without a test score, they will still accept your application fee and process your application. When a school says they're test optional, they don't give you information about how likely you are to get in with or without a test score. And so you have some colleges that are what we call truly test optional. Often the colleges that were test optional before the pandemic are a good indication here. So a college like Wake Forest, right? They were test optional before COVID hit, and they are test optional now. Test preferred would be colleges that tend to accept students with test scores at a higher rate than students without. So University of Alabama they accept about 70-ish, 70 to 75, depending on the year, percent of their class with standardized test scores. They're test preferred. Then you have some other schools that are test required with rare exceptions. And we use this to indicate schools with a very, very high percentage of students admitted with standardized testing. Now, fortunately, most of the schools that would have once fallen into this category, like Purdue, Ohio State, they have actually gone back to requiring test scores, which is great because they're not saying they're test optional and then actually acting like they're test required. Transparency is a very good thing in this process. The more, the better, as far as we're concerned. But it's important to just understand that not all test optional schools are as optional as one another. And you have to do some additional research in that regard. I can talk more about how to figure that out in the Q&A if we have time. But the bottom line when it comes to test optional is that a strong score is still an admissions asset. The more selective your college goals are, the more important having this score becomes. Two reasons. One, we just saw the data, especially at more selective schools, the test score is that much more powerful than a GPA for the prediction the college is trying to make about a student's success freshman year. And then two, those selective schools, you want every single thing you can have to go in your favor, and the test score is just one more of those elements. When you have a strong score, it will expand your options for merit scholarships and choice of where you attend college. So that's really important to keep in mind. I could talk more about scholarships and test scores again in the Q&A if we have time. And then the last point here, which is a very important point, is that if you are a student for whom obtaining what would be a strong standardized test score would just require too much of your energy and time to be worth it, there are still plenty of options out there for a student to apply without a test score that are legitimately test optional options where we see students have success without scores every year. So with that in mind, I'm going to very briefly talk about the digital SAT and the ACT because most of you are already aware of these. But the digital SAT is essentially now a 4-section test, 2 reading and writing modules, 2 math modules, and the test is adaptive, meaning the first module of each section is a standard difficulty, and you'll be fed into an easier or harder second module depending on your performance there, and that will dictate the range of scores that you can test into. The ACT in its current form is a 4-section test. It's going to change between the July test date and the September test date. So if you're a senior still, or a rising senior still planning to take the SAT as of the September date, it will be in a new format. If you're taking the current version of the ACT, it's 4 sections, which are averaged together to make a score out of 36. And the most important big picture difference between the SAT and the ACT is not the science section, which is what everyone always harps on. It's timing. The ACT is a much faster paced test than the SAT. So generally speaking, if a student is a fast enough worker, they're going to end up doing better on the ACT than the SAT, whereas the SAT gives you more complex, difficult questions, but gives you more time to work through them. The enhanced ACT is when we're going to see some changes to the test. And essentially, the composite score is now going to be a 3-section composite score from English, math, and reading. And then there are 2 optional sections, an optional science section, which you should take, and an optional writing section, which you should not take. The ACT writing section is required by no colleges. It used to be most, and then some, and then a few, and then one, and now zero. So you really do not need to be taking the ACT writing section at all. Save yourself the time, save yourself the headaches, save yourself the registration fee. The science section of the ACT, though, is becoming optional at registration, but most colleges haven't announced their policy yet. We've seen Boston University requiring the science section still. They have come out and said we're still requiring ACT science. And we've seen the Bright Futures Scholarship Program in Florida for any of our Florida residents still requires the science section of the ACT. But most colleges haven't announced a policy yet. Many have actually announced that it'll be optional for them as well. But the point is, at this point, to keep your options open, plan on taking science. If you know exactly what tests, or sorry, what colleges you're applying to, when you go to register for your test, then at that point, you can make an informed decision about whether to skip science or not, because by fall of next year, hopefully they've all announced their policies. With the enhanced ACT, the format of the test is changing rather, but not the content. So the ACT is testing the same old content, same old question types as ever. But the big difference is that the format of the test will look different. Math is moving from 5 answer choices down to 4 answer choices. They're adding question stems in the English section to questions that would just give you answer choices to pick the right way to punctuate something. Now they say which of these choices is most grammatically correct, but it's the same basic task for students. Pardon my allergy throat. So essentially, a lot of the differences are superficial. The big non-superficial difference is that the test will be shorter and you'll have more time per question. So what that means is that it'll be a little easier for students to finish on time, but still much harder to finish on time than the SAT. Some data from ACT recently showed us that actually students aren't completing the English or math section at a higher rate anymore, or at any different rate than they were before. Completion rates, as in the percentage of students who actually finish the section, are the same in English and math, but students are finishing reading and science at a higher rate on the new version of the test, which makes sense to me as a test prep tutor because reading and science are two of the most time-intensive sections on the test. So this will only be relevant if you are testing this fall, and we can talk more about these changes in the Q&A if you'd like to. But for now, I want to move on and just talk test dates. Let's talk big picture test prep plans for the rest of the year. So what I have here is the full year of SAT and ACT test dates. And the important things are highlighted in yellow. I have the final test date that is typically accepted for most colleges' early action and early decision deadlines. So if you're planning to apply to those early deadlines, which most of our students will, at least for some of their schools, then the September ACT and the October SAT are typically the last test dates that are going to be in time for your deadlines. If you are applying for regular deadlines to college, which are typically going to be around New Year's, then you can take both tests through December of senior year. There's also a new September SAT date. This is very exciting to me personally, and probably to no one else. Although if you're a senior who's going to have to take the SAT in the fall, it is nice to just have more options for what's going to be convenient for your schedule and all of that. So I screenshot this if you're going to be testing again this year, because this is kind of your full menu of options and you'll know what's going to be accepted by most schools. I do recommend, however, contacting individual schools if you think it might be helpful for you to take one of the later test dates here. Specifically, sometimes the October ACT is accepted for early action or early decision deadlines. I know as of 2 years ago, a student of ours called Vanderbilt and asked, and Vanderbilt was taking the October ACT for early action, early decision deadlines. These things can change year to year, so don't even take it as truth right now that I say that Vanderbilt will. You would still want to call them this year. But the point is, just do your due diligence on these things. So in terms of what we can do to help at this point, I know many of our students have already wrapped up testing. If you're thinking about testing again, I just had a call with a junior family. They're, happy with their test score, proud of what they've done so far, wanted to run me through their college list and see, what do you think we should be doing? Should we test again? If so, when? Let's talk through our summer activity schedule. Let's talk through end of year, AP exams, all that, and figure out when would it make sense for us to try again if we should try again. This QR code up in the top of my screen will book you a meeting right into my calendar if you want to talk about this. We'll make ourselves big for the Q&A in case your phone's not picking up that tiny little QR code in my thumbnail image. Sometimes we recommend diagnostic testing, especially if your student's been trying the SAT a few times and it's just not been going well. Then we might say, why don't you try a practice ACT and let's see if that could go any better for you. And we'll share this with all of the attendees if you think you might want to try an SAT or try an ACT if you've been mostly focused on the other. The main thing is when we work with students on test prep, we meet them where they are with sessions that are targeted only to the areas where they actually need to improve. So we use practice testing and practice exercises to identify the areas where a student can improve the most and really focus our actual instructional time on the areas that are going to get the most points in the future. And with that, I will stop boring you with standardized testing and hand it over to Alyssa for some fun stuff.
Yes, so it will be entirely qualitative from here on out for the rest of the evening, though I think Jordan's going to have a couple of statistics for us later on down the line when he talks to us about building the college list. But for the moment, let's chat about extracurricular activities. So, this is one of the 5 factors under your control. And the reason why colleges look at extracurriculars is because this is something that is entirely under a student's control. A student has to take courses. You can't not go to school. So although a student can choose among the courses available, it's still a forced choice. Extracurricular activities, what a student does and pursues in their personal time, that is something that is entirely driven by the student and the interests and passions that drive them. And one of the things that I want to highlight in this case is, although it's an interesting thing about this title, although when it comes to a given activity, depth is going to matter more than breadth, I want to emphasize the breadth of possible options that are available to a student and that count as an extracurricular or an activity. That could be, of course, playing a sport or playing in band or orchestra, but that could be also pursuing other creative talents. That could be intellectual pursuits from Quiz Bowl to summer programs to emailing professors over the summer and seeing if you can reach out and do research with them. That can be social justice or civic engagement. It can be pursuing your own personal interests, posting form critiques of weightlifting on TikTok and building a following that way. It can be developing leadership and mentorship opportunities. There are many different options that a student can pursue. And what we would encourage a student to do, regardless of where in this breadth they choose to land, is to try and pursue that particular interest with depth rather than breadth. If you are, a student who is interested in one particular thing, build on that thing that you are already doing. You don't have to join 3 new clubs in senior year. Jordan is a former admissions officer and will tell you that everyone knows what it means when a student joins 3 new clubs senior year. It may be that you're exploring new interests, but it also may be that there's a little bit of college panic going on there. Instead, consider applying for a leadership position in a club that already matters to you, or reaching out beyond school-sponsored activities. There are so many different ways to engage that as long as a student can quantify them, you can build interesting and thoughtful ways to pursue what you love, whether that's hosting a podcast, creating an app, completing coding challenges if you're a computer science person and putting them on GitHub, whether that's organizing a book club, whether that is taking a Coursera course to explore something that interests you. There are ways to take what a student has already done up to, here we are in the tail end of junior year and develop and deepen that in a way that is authentic to who they are. And one of the best times to do this, and one of the last big opportunities to do so before early applications start going out, is to utilize this summer to pursue one of those projects. Pursue an internship, do research, choose a thing that matters, and explore it to the best of your ability.
Now, thinking about the colleges and universities that are eventually going to go onto your list, that will see all of the great activities that you've talked about, will see the recommendation letters, your transcripts, the test scores as well, is just as important as all of the information that we've chatted about as well. There are just around 4,000 colleges and universities in the United States. You have a lot to choose from. So it can be sort of overwhelming when you start to think about which colleges and universities you want to think about. However, it's really important to know that you can start to narrow it down through different criteria that are important to you. And it's very much okay to be superficial. If you live in a warm weather location right now and you say, I never want to be cold again, then you can limit your locations to being in warm weather states and cities and places that are important to you. If you want to be in a major city with a zoo because you love zoos and you love animals, that can be a criteria as well. Be as personal and authentic to this because you're not just choosing an institution or a college, you're choosing a home to be in for the next 4 years as well. So really think about how you're going to live both on campus, in class, in your extracurricular activities, but also in what's going on in the environment around you. Again, if you never want to be cold again, going into Minnesota probably is not going to be the best option for you. It is freezing there, and this is someone who lives in Florida right now. So think about those different factors and think about what's important to you, not important to your friend, not important to your counselor, not important to the people whispering in your ear. Really, that's important to you and where you want to be as well. Now, to start narrowing down those different institutions into a list that makes sense for you, there's this idea of match and fit. And it's kind of this amorphous idea that you'll hear throughout the entire college admission process of fit. What does it mean for you to fit in with a college? Well, one way that you can think about it is in these four different lenses. The social fit. Who is going to college here? Who are the types of people that are on campus? Are they mostly from the state where they are because it's the state institution and the institution really caters to students from that location? Or are they global? They're coming from all around the world, all around the country. That's something to think about. Physical, where is this location? Is it close to home? Is it farther away from home? Do you have to take a plane or can you be on a bus or drive back home if you would like to? Is it close to the city? Is it close to a suburb? Is it in the middle of nowhere? Are you okay with these things? Financial fit is also really important as well. What does my financial responsibility look like for not only the 4 years that I'm here, but also afterward? What sort of considerations am I getting for merit scholarships or for need-based scholarships and need-based aid as well? Those factors are incredibly important, and thinking about that as a family, not necessarily as a single student, but as a family can really help make that decision a lot smoother as well and make the process smoother too. And notice that academic fit is last on your list here, or last of the considerations here. Because realistically, if you're thinking about some of the ubiquitous but still worthy topics to study, things like political science, or maybe business, economics, biology, almost every institution is going to have one of those programs available for you. So you kind of have the pick of the litter. If you are thinking about something that's incredibly specialized, things like aerospace engineering or marine biology, Alyssa and I can give you your college list tomorrow and then you're done. Because those are going to be very specific and highly specialized programs that are going to be concentrated within a certain few locations. Marine biology is kind of hard to do in Kansas, things like that. But all that to say that you shouldn't ignore the academic fit as well. If you're thinking about specific courses or wanting to be in bigger lecture halls or wanting to have that kind of close, intimate relationship of a liberal arts institution where you're having seminars and discussing, those factors are important to consider, but maybe not as important as some of the other factors that are here on the match and fit list as well. Now we bring up this other part of match and fit of the categories of reach, target, and likely schools. One of them is kind of a disappearing breed. We will talk about that in a moment. But as you can imagine, a reach school is a school that is challenging to be admitted to, typically anywhere less than 25% admit rate. Regardless of who you are, you can be a stellar academic student, have everything going for you. But again, it is very unlikely to be admitted to that school, so it is a reach school for everybody. Generally thinking anywhere between 26% and 75% admit rate is a possible, likely, or a target school rather, ones that you should be aiming for, ones that you are fitting within the middle 50% of testing ranges as well as GPA ranges as well. Keep in mind that this is a sliding scale, both for reach, target, and likely, depending on who you are as a student, and we'll talk about that in just a moment as well. And then anything typically later, or rather higher than a 75% admit rate, is a likely school. This is a school that you're more likely to be admitted to than others. Typically, most public schools might fall into that range, except for, let's say, the UC system or University of Michigan, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, for examples. But again, we're thinking about what each school on your list can be categorized by. And we'll talk about how to necessarily not really balance that, but at least approach that list as far as reaches, targets, and likelies. But for that example, we'll look at the University of Vermont. Last year, there were students who were ranging, rather, of the current students who were on campus in their first year class. That range of SAT and ACT scores was anywhere from 1270 to a 1410, and a 29 to a 32. The average GPA is 3.85 out of 4%. And the in-state and out-of-state admit rates were different because they are an in-state institution. So 71% for Vermonters, let's go with that, and 60% for out-of-state students. So again, depending on what your statistics look like, the University of Vermont rather will look very different for you and be categorized differently. So for student A, who's well above those middle 50% for testing and GPA, this is a likely school, that they're very likely to be admitted to the school because the admit rate is above that 25% that will automatically qualify something as a reach. And their statistics are above what we're seeing in the middle 50%. For student B, they're smack dab in the middle of that. And again, because of that admit rate, this is a target school for them. So this is something that they should be aiming to be admitted to. They're really falling within that middle 50. And then student C is falling a little bit below their middle 50% for testing and GPA. So it would be a reach for them, even though it's not necessarily in that automatic reach category, a 25% admit rate. It's still something to consider that, again, depending on the institution, depending on the student, that reach, target, and likely categorization can be different depending on where you're going, what institutions you're looking at as well. There's always a question of how many schools should be on a list. Some people say you should have 9 schools, 3 reaches, 3 targets, 3 likelies. Our idea of that is that you don't necessarily need to have a balanced list, but you should have a list that you should be able to handle. That means the amount of work. Typically, when you apply to a lot of reach schools or schools that are in that 25% admit rate or lower, they have a lot of supplemental essays, which Alyssa will touch on in a little bit. But that's just extra essays that you'll have to send specifically to those schools. So if you are able to really prioritize your time and make time for those essays, we're down, we're game, let's do it. However, regardless of what your college list looks like, we always recommend that you should have 2 to 3 likely schools, not only that you can live with, but that you're actively excited about as well. That you should say, if everything works out here and I only get into 2 to 3 of my likely schools, then I'm going to be excited to have choices among these schools. It's really important to be realistic about those lists as well, because everybody feels better when the quote worst option is one that you're still excited to go to as well. Again, the list that you can handle as well is really important. If you are being really reachy with your list, you should be prepared to hear no from a lot of those schools because it's just a numbers game. There are institutions out there, including one that I used to work for, that said if every single of their 2,500 students that they admitted said no, they could go to the wait list, admit another 2,500 students, and have the statistics be exactly the same. So it really just means that there are tons of qualified students who would do well at these institutions that are getting told no just because it's a numbers game. So again, we want to make sure that you're prepared to potentially hear more, no more often than not if you have a reachy list. But again, we're here for you if you want to. How do you determine whether it's a reach, target, or likely? Again, as the slide says, it's kind of an art and a science. You have some data available to you if your school uses Naviance. You can take a look at some of the historical data at your high school as well to see what students from your high school have been admitted to those schools previously. The really great piece of information that, again, I'm a higher ed nerd, so I love diving into the data that's available on the Common Data Set. But this is a great place to see some information about middle 50% of test scores, admit rates, in-state and out-of-state admit rates, things like that as well. As you take a look at as you take a look at some of this college data, as Jim was saying beforehand with the NFL Combine analogy, which I love and I'm definitely stealing, is that the longer term, those grades are going to be the bigger factor, determining factor than just the one day of the combine or just the one day of the SAT or ACT. So as you take a look at that data, keep in mind that test scores are important, but maybe not as emblematic of your academic experience as the grades are. Take a look in consideration of test optional as well. Jim just went over that information. You can see what their test policies are as well on the common data set to see whether they are test optional, whether they require 100% of their students to send in testing, things like that. And again, be honest, not hopeful. Be really realistic about what your test scores and what your grades look like and what your college list looks like as well. If you end up applying to, again, a very reachy list, then make sure that you're prepared to hear no more often than not. Again, just a numbers game, not anything having to do with you as an individual student. Again, we have the idea of what a likely school is, and that likely school should be where you're above the 75th percentile of the test scores in GPA and or class rank if your college or university, or rather if your institution reports that. You should have 2 to 3 of these schools that you're excited about and be actively excited about them. Look for other opportunities also to make sure that your likely school can be still a rigorous experience. Look for honors programs, look for specialty programs, look for ways to do faculty research or mentorship, or look for ways to enhance the experience that you're on campus, not just in likely schools, but wherever you're going. But that's one way to make a likely school that maybe doesn't look as good or isn't as exciting a way to be more exciting, to be more customized to your academic experience. And again, it's a great way to reduce pressure and make sure that you are excited about somewhere that you could potentially go and find a really great home for you as well. This really is the most important part of the college list too. Everybody can think of a reach school, but it's really challenging sometimes to think about those likelies. So that's something we can help with. If you end up working with us, we can start to have conversation about the college list and think about what goes onto your application as well.
So we have saved what I think is by far the most fun topic for last. Jim is laughing at me because we have this argument every single time we do a webinar together. But that is starting with college essays. This is our fifth and final factor under your control, and this is the moment where students get to speak to admissions officers entirely in their own voice. It can be one of the most distinguishing factors in an application, especially at that very high tier of school where a student is applying alongside students that may look very similar to them when it comes to grades, to rigor, even in access to extracurriculars. And when it comes time to start working on college essays, don't worry yet, but do call us because we are coming up on the single best moment, or at least worst moment, to work on your college essays. Junior year is incredibly busy. Many of the students that we are working with currently have taken a little bit of a pause in their process to focus on studying for and taking their AP exams. But senior year is going to be equally rigorous, if not more so. Many students may be taking more rigorous courses senior year than they are junior year. Take advantage of the time when students are not in school to try and get the vast majority, if not all, of the essays and applications done. Senior year grades, especially the first half, are incredibly important. The last thing any student wants is to realize that on top of the, honors biology and honors calculus that they have signed themselves up for, they are also secretly enrolled in honors college essay writing because they have left all of their supplements until the last minute. This is the moment to start brainstorming, outlining, drafting, and revising for all of those essays. So there are a number of essays that a student might have to write over the course of this process. And we're going to walk through each of them in turn and then focus in on the two most important. The most important here is going to be the personal statement or the Common App essay. That is the essay that is the most free form, that gives the student a chance to introduce themselves to the admissions officer, show what makes them tick, and that is going to go to almost every single school that a student applies to. Even for the University of California schools, it's likely that your Common App personal statement might get cut down, repurposed, and used for one of your PIQs. This is going to be by far the most important essay that you write, and it's one that you can start writing now, even if you're unsure of your college list. The rest of these essays on this slide are what we call supplemental or school-specific essays. Depending on the school, and more often than not, these are going to be the more selective schools. They may ask students to submit an essay written explicitly for them, whereas the personal statement goes everywhere. These essays might be why college or why your major. Why do you want to study what you want to study? Why do you want to do it here? Community and diversity essays that ask students to reflect on a community that is important to them or an aspect of their identity and background that matters to them. A discussion of their most significant activity in high school, club, job, hobby. Any of those things could work. But there's also some miscellaneous essays that are sort of fun. The University of Chicago is notorious for having utterly wild prompts every single year. The University of Vermont, that we've talked about earlier, asks students what kind of ice cream flavor they would be. But there are a range of different options that students can have to write to. But first and foremost, we're going to focus in on the personal statement. So this is the personal statement is often called the Common App essay. Sometimes it's just called the college essay. This is that 650-word essay that goes everywhere. If for some reason a student wants to use the coalition application, you can. It's going to be a very similar prompt, just a little bit shorter. But this essay gives the student the opportunity to show who they are. And because of that, the most important part for this essay is that brainstorming process. It is the most important part of essay brainstorming, and we'll talk about that on the next slide, where before even the very first word goes on the very first page for the very first draft of this essay, identifying the right topic, the right frame, and the right anecdote can set a student up to have a much easier time in the writing process and to really show admissions officers who they are. And the way we help our students do this, and we encourage anyone to, is to start with this idea of what do we need to know about you, the student, and to truly write everything down. Favorite color, funny nicknames, the story with the kayak that happened last summer at summer camp, the names of your pets, absolutely everything, focusing on stories, experiences, and why they are meaningful. And this can be a great moment to sit down with your parents, to sit down with your friends without arguing and just collect as much information as possible, because from there, it gives you a chance to look back and reflect and go, what are the things that show up more often than not? What are the things that I keep doing again and again in my extracurriculars? I keep working with students and with books. This is something that matters to me. I keep color coding every single thing that I work on in school. What does this say about me? And from there, you can generate thoughtful and authentic ideas for the personal statement. The next major essay type, this is the most common type of supplemental essay, either the Y college or the Y major essay. And you can tell from these two examples that often these two topics are going to blur into each other. Sometimes universities will ask simply for why do you want to major, what you want to major in, but more often it's what do you want to study and why do you want to do it here. And in this case, it's a combination of showing who the student is, what interests them intellectually, and showing how it fits with the given school or university. So it's the combination, that Venn diagram of research and specificity about the school, as well as personal detail and authenticity about how a student envisions themselves on that campus. This is the same for students who might be undecided and who might struggle to answer that question of what do you want to study? 80% of American college students change their major over the course of 4 years. It is 100% okay to be undecided. And in some ways, the advice we give for students when it comes to that why major, what do you want to study and why, is going to be the same. Show how you are interested in an intellectual enterprise. That can be by talking about past experiences, meaningful class moments, projects that compelled you, as well as envisioning yourself on a college campus. What are the problems in the world that fascinate you, that you want to contribute to solving? What are the burning questions that you need to know the answer to? What things interest you academically and intellectually? And if those things all roughly fall within a single major, spectacular. Then major in that thing. But if your interests transcend majors, or if you're not sure which interest you want to pursue, it's all right to display that multitude of interests. The ultimate goal simply here is to show that you are interested and interesting. It's like walking into a buffet and going, I can't decide what I want to eat because I'm starving and everything looks good. That's the impression we want to give for these essays, rather than walking into a restaurant and going, I don't know, I guess we could order something. That's incredibly frustrating in a restaurant, and it also doesn't make for a very good essay. So when it comes to this process, the way we factor in is that we work with students from the very beginning of the process, from that initial brainstorming of what do we need to know about you, through identifying a topic, doing further rounds of brainstorming to vet and assure that that topic is the right one, developing outlines, coaching students through revision, restructuring, bringing it down to the word limit, all the way through with unlimited support, meetings, and feedback. Although the student, of course, needs to write their essay, admissions officers need to get to know them, not us. Um, We provide support every step of the way, all the way through, including deferral and waitlist follow-up for every single student until, as Jordan and I joked at the very beginning of this presentation, that we are texting students, congratulating them on their schools and making sure that they've turned in their housing deposit. We can also assist with interview prep where it's needed, as well as both holistic conversations and database searches for our college list. So ultimately, what the goal is, and we want to give our juniors to sort a little bit of a takeaway for the end of the presentation before we move to Q&A. Juniors, your grades are still going to be the most important part. Don't let it slack now. Finish junior year strong, sprint over that finish line. Focus on getting great grades between now and the end of the year. If you haven't requested your letters of recommendation yet, please do so. Give your teachers the opportunity to address those over the over the summer. If you haven't finished your SAT or ACT testing, now's a great time to do so, to make plans to do so over the summer, or to make plans for a fall test. To continue to develop your extracurricular interests over the summer and in the fall. And of course, contact us about essays and applications. We'll actually be doing another webinar at the end of the month. I believe it is May 22nd. I'm sure Jim's about to correct me if I'm wrong, but May 22nd, we'll be doing another webinar, which is a deep dive into essays and applications, but do reach out to us now to get that process started. This is sort of the moment to capitalize on the summer and start working on that. With that, thank you for joining. I see plenty of questions coming in to the Q&A. So we'll stick around and answer as many of those as we have time for. All right. So, Jordan, I'll let you take this one. The counselor in our school said not to worry about letters of recommendation until the beginning of senior year. That being said, should the student still be asking junior year core subject teachers?
You're more than welcome to ask junior year core subject teachers, especially because they have a full year of understanding who you are, getting that relationship started as well. And then you would then give them the summer to consider the recommendation letter that you're asking them to write. If you're having a new teacher your senior year, typically admission deadlines are in November, December, January-ish. So you're only giving them a couple months impression of you to then have a senior year schedule, or rather a senior year teacher giving you a recommendation. So that being said, go with a teacher that knows you best. If that junior year teacher is a strong recommender and can write you a strong recommendation, that's completely fine. Again, typically if colleges are going to have a stipulation on their time limit, it's going to be junior or senior year.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. Jim, I know the pollen is truly getting to you. You can punt this question back to me if you need, but how would you determine whether or not a college is truly test optional?
So, no amount of pollen is going to make me shut up about test optional policies. So, here we go. Welcome to my primer on how to determine how test optional a college is. It starts as so many college searches start with the name of a university, followed by the acronym CDS. You can see in our Google suggestions that stands for Common Data Set, one of the best places to get information about colleges. The common data set, you look for the most recent year available. In the case of University of Vermont, which I'm just picking on because it was our example from earlier, we pick 2004, 2005. All right. Now, to navigate to the standardized testing portion of this, my trick is to do Command F or Control F, depending on whether you're on a PC or Mac, and just type composite. And that will take you to the part that shows us testing information. Let's zoom in so we can all see this clearly. And it will show you the percentage of students who submitted test scores from the enrolled freshman class of that university. So you add together the percentage that submitted SAT, the percentage that submitted ACT, and we learned that at the University of Vermont, roughly 35% of their freshmen submitted scores. Typically, if this number is around 50% or less, that's going to be a fairly truly test optional school because it's telling you that they are accepting half or more of their students without test scores. I'm also, while I'm speaking about this, Alyssa, I'll skip ahead to another question, which was about, if 35% of students are submitting scores and they tell us the 50th percentile as of this common data set is a 1360, well, then how is that an actual 50th percentile? And the answer is it's not. So essentially, what we're looking at here is the 50th percentile of the top 35% of scores to the University of Vermont, because when students withhold scores, they're withholding them because they're not as good. Generally speaking, the 35% of scores that were submitted are understood to be the top 35%. So when we look at a 50th percentile here for the University of Vermont, that is the 50th percentile of the top 35% of the scores, which is to say it is the 17 and a half, top 17.5% score. So what that means is, if for practical purposes, the 25th percentile is a more useful number if you're at home trying to decide whether or not to submit a score to a specific college. Because if you're above this 25th percentile, it means you're above the 25th percentile of the top 35%. So you're going to be well within showing that college that you're academically ready insofar as your test score does that. That is obviously far from a guarantee of admissions in a holistic review process, but it does, essentially sending a test score that's above a 25th percentile typically is going to help you more than withholding that score. And now I will take a break to cough while we go to the next question.
Yes. Jordan, we had another question coming in, around that idea of the holistic admissions process and asking, how does demonstrated interest factor into admissions, and how does a student go about showing that?
Yeah, so demonstrated interest is a term that refers to the perception of an applicant's level of interest in the institution as measured by multiple factors, whether that's physically visiting the institution, whether that's interacting with it virtually, going online to its website, opening email links, doing virtual chats or things like that, or going to in-person events in their area, college visits, or rather college tours, um, high school visits to the university comes to your high school. Any way that you can interact with the institution is then factored into the admission process. Some schools will be more upfront about it than others. The CDS, the Common Data Set that Jim just went through, is a great place to determine the level of demonstrated interest in that consideration. Anywhere from not considered, where colleges do not care whether you interact with them, to considered, which typically means that you need to write a good supplemental essay. That's kind of the general rule of thumb there. If it's important, then we always encourage our students to reach out to the admission officers, visit the campus, do what they can to make sure that they're showing some sort of interest. And then there's very important, and there's only a handful of schools that say it's very important. I used to work at one of them, and that means that you have to visit, you have to pester them, you have to email them, you have to be really on top of showing that you want to go to that institution. And the way that I would quote sell it when I was at that institution is that the more you learn about that university, it was American University, not to bury the lead, but the more you learn about American University, the better of a fit you will find out that it is because you've been to a session, you have talked to an admission officer, you've been on campus, you understand what it means to be there, and then hopefully that translates to your essays that then will translate to the admission process as well. So demonstrated interest is very important for for a handful of schools, but the schools that's important to, they really, really care about it. So do everything that you can to interact with them as often as you can.
All right. I think, Jim, I may have to bother you one more time. We've got another standardized test question coming in. Can you tell us about how the adaptive feature on the digital SAT works?
Sure. So I could talk about this for probably 3 hours on its own. So I'm going to try to rein myself in. Luckily, my throat might help me do that. So the basic idea is that your performance in module one of math or of reading and writing dictates the difficulty level of module two. To zoom out a second, the test uses a psychometric theory called item response theory. And if I could just summarize it into layman's terms without boring anyone with a complicated algorithm, what it really means is that every student starts with a predicted SAT score range for a section between 200 and 800, right? That's the full range of what you can actually score. Every time you get a question right or wrong, that range shrinks. So if you get a question wrong, okay, well, now you can't get an 800 anymore. Your predicted score range is 790 to 200 instead of 800 to 200. You get a question right, okay, it's 240 to 800 instead of 200 to 800. So this range narrows over the course of the whole section, and you'll get a module two of a difficulty that is dictated by your predicted score range after the first module. And upon the completion of the second module, your predicted score will be down to a specific score. Of course, they're not that specific. They all end in a zero, so it only goes by multiples of 10. But the first module gets you down to a score range that dictates which second module you get. And then that second module gets you down to a specific score. The idea here is that the questions that help us determine where a student falls in an SAT math score range, say between like 400 and 550 in SAT math, and should that student be a 420 or should they be a 430? Those questions are not the same questions as the ones that determine whether a student should be a 770 or a 760, right? It's a completely different thing. It's not going to tell you anything useful, right? One question is going to be too hard to be useful in one direction. The other is going to be too easy to be useful in the other. So the SAT went adaptive this way so that they could be as specific as they always have in assigning students scores while shrinking the number of questions and giving students more specific questions in that second module. And that's kind of the short answer, or as short as I can make it, of how the test is adaptive.
We have another question about University of Arizona specifically, that they have a program called the SALT program, which stands for Strategic Alternative Learning Techniques for students with attention or learning disorders. This is something that can be a really important part of a student's list. In some ways, this speaks to that academic fit component that Jordan spoke about earlier. Many universities are going to have some amount of um, disability support. There's going to be an office that provides support in that area. That is something that you would want to vet. But some of the schools that you might potentially take a look at might be University of Iowa has the REACH program, Indiana has the CIP program, Penn State has LEAP. This would be something where I can rattle off a couple, but dig into this and see what expressly is going to fit your students and your family's needs.
And one thing I can add in this regard, just if you are, a student who has a 504 or an IEP or accommodations at school because of some kind of learning difference, often when it comes time for college, you may need to retest. In other words, if you had this 504 in place because you've been in the same district since fourth grade when you got the testing done, well, that might not fly for a college. They might need to see more up-to-date testing data than a test from fourth grade that showed that you had dyslexia, right? So that's something to keep in mind and communicate proactively with your schools about as you are starting to enroll, because you want to make sure whether you're looking for a specific program like we just talked about or not, that you have your accommodations in place so that you're set up to succeed in college.
I think those are Actually, we have one more SAT question coming in for you, Jim. Once again, it's going to be about that diagnostic fuzziness. So if you don't do well in Module 1, are you just locked out of a certain range in Module 2?
Good question. Short answer, yes. But I will add to that is not really a change from a non-adaptive test. In other words, if you miss a bunch of questions in the first half of the previous version of the SAT that wasn't adaptive, you were already locked out of the top end of the score curve. So really, it's kind of a distinction without a difference. If you miss a bunch of questions, you get a lower score. If you miss a bunch of questions, you go to the easier module two, and then you can't get as high of a score. So mechanically, it's different. The math works a little differently in terms of how the scores are actually output. But again, if you're missing a bunch of questions early in the test, it's going to cap what score you can get, whether it's adaptive or not.
All right. I think those are all of the questions that we have for this evening. Thank you so much for hanging out with us tonight and enjoy the rest of your evening, everyone. Please feel free to share this with anyone, and we're always happy to talk about more specific questions. You have our contact information. You'll be getting an email from us soon with the recap and YouTube link.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Have a good night.